How can you boomerang back to an old employer? How can you return to a previous employer? So here are a few things that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what is a boomerang employee, and I've kind of given that away already. We'll also talk about the trends and different projections of what we're seeing in boomerang employees, reasons to consider becoming a boomerang employee. And of course, I've mentioned already that we will have an audience Q&A where you'll be able to ask your questions. Okay, so what is a boomerang employee? Well, a boomerang employee is someone who returns to a previous employer. In fact, recent data from ADP payroll source cites that boomerang employees increased this year to the highest amount in almost 10 years. Boomerangs, as they're called, accounted for 35% of all new hires among companies, as reported to ADP this year. That is the highest that it has been in 10 years, as I mentioned. So that is pretty incredible. Now, previous data suggests that 76% of HR professionals are more accepting of boomerang employees. 40% in the hiring space say they've hired more than one boomerang employee, and over 50% say they give high priority to these candidates. Now, as far as employees are concerned, about 15% of those surveyed said that they have boomeranged back to an old employer, and 40% of people say that they would consider it. So I think this is really interesting data to share because it is something that it's not necessarily a phenomenon that is uncommon from both the employee and employer perspective. Boomerang candidates and eventual hires provide benefits to the employer and the organization, as well as to you yourself as a boomerang employee. So let's take a look at some of these benefits from both perspectives. So, for example, you as a job seeker, it is a great benefit for you in this process because you are going to be familiar and have a lot of familiarity with your former employer's processes and procedures. You would be a great rehire because you could come back and quickly, kind of quote unquote, hit the ground running, as they say, because of your previous experience at the organization. Your onboarding time isn't going to take as long. Boomerang employees typically are more successful because they have already established internal networks with other people working at the organization, which makes it easier for them to be more effective in their position more quickly. Also, for policy and procedural purposes, your former employer will have you on board just the same as any new hire would. But again, it's likely going to go a little bit faster because you've already been through the process once and you're familiar with the systems. And it also, they will onboard you in another, reason for doing so, even though you've been through the process once before, is so that you're not receiving any special treatment, or a newer employee might, in case they would think that. That's typically a normal process to go through onboarding a second time. Now, the company also benefits from hiring somebody who has worked there before. And here's why. It is because there are reduced expenses for things like training and certifications, because returning workers likely already have the qualifications for employment, particularly if you're coming back into a similar position. Employee morale tends to be higher because workers see that you don't hold grudges when somebody leaves. And so for the people who stayed or who have been there for a while, if they see that you've hired somebody back and you're not holding anything against them for leaving, that really does help improve employee morale. Also, it's a reduced risk of losing the employee. Returning workers are more likely to stay long term, and there are also fewer surprises associated with hiring someone you already know. You guys were kind of in the groove together as employee-employer before. Also, I think it's important to point out that returning employees can bring fresh ideas to the team because of their outside experience that they have previously had since they left in the interim, which also can help your business grow. So that's something that is, I think, really important and really interesting too, as being a part of a boomerang employment situation. All right, so if you were to job search as a boomerang employee, these are some of the things that you want to consider. Some of the things are a little bit different than a typical job search. So, first and foremost, keeping lines of communication open and continuing to build the relationship after you leave a position is important. This is why you don't want to exit a job and burn the house down. You want to keep your relationships intact because your connections and relationships with others can really help during transition periods. So being mindful of how you left or how you leave a position can have an impact on whether or not you could return. So you want to continue to build bridges. Go back and look at your resignation letter and examine how you resigned, what the reason was for your resignation, and then your choice of wording. Hopefully, the phrasing within your letter was professional, gracious, and complimentary to allow for an opening of the conversation of returning to work. Also, it's important to consider that things change, and having an open mind is one of the best tips to becoming a boomerang employee. So, you don't want to assume that things are going to be the same. You don't want to assume that people, processes, and and the company as a whole is the same. In fact, people change, processes change, companies grow, people grow. So you're going to come back to a similar environment, but it's not going to be the exact same. And you want to realize and understand that things may be different the second time around. That's going to help ease the transition. As a boomerang candidate, know that your former employer has more contacts at their ready for reference checking, meaning they can and they will likely reach out to some of your previous coworkers or teammates and supervisors. And here are some questions that they might ask them. What was it like to work with so and so? What were their main strengths and weaknesses? And would you want to work with them again? Why or why not? So, whether you reached out to your previous employer or they have reached out to you, it is important to realize that you might not be the only qualified candidate for the specific position. Take the interview seriously. That's going to be an important part of the hiring process for you. Continue and do the same things you would do in a regular job search, like researching the company, finding out any new information, learning about the potential interviewer if you don't know them or you didn't work in conjunction with them previously. There might have been a leadership change within the company since you left. So doing this research is important because it's going to help you kind of even get up to speed before you would re-enter working at the company once you get a job offer. Also, think about this. Chances are you may have gained new skills while you were away. It's important to state how you have grown since you've left, as this will help again with negotiating your salary and the salary, the offer that they give to you. You may not be you may not be able to negotiate any other benefits, but you certainly could counter offer with a salary. And it's a great time and opportunity for you to see if there have been any adjustments or changes to benefits and vacation policies. It's also a good practice to keep in mind that the process might be slightly different depending on the size of the company and the type of role you return to. Smaller companies might be more conversational, whereas if you worked at a larger company before, the process might be a bit more formalized. So for everybody out there listening, it's also going to depend on the type of company and size of company you were at previously. All right, so let's briefly talk about some interview questions you might come across. If possible, before you do your interview, you want to find out who you will be interviewing with. And know that it could be people you used to work for or work with, but it also could be somebody entirely new, ones you may not have worked with when you were there before. So with this in mind, you want to make sure you describe both your past accomplishments and responsibilities, as well as any new skills you might have gained since you left. And we mentioned that previously. Also, be prepared for some tough questions and questions that might center around why you left before. You want to own the story of your decision that you made to leave and manage any concerns or labeling that might result of you being a flight risk. So you want to focus more, if you can, on the specific reasons why you are excited to come back and what you have missed about the company and the work since you've been gone. And remember, it's really okay to admit that you made a mistake in leaving. You want to be gracious for the opportunity to interview again as a boomerang candidate. So here are some questions that might come your way. If we look at the slide, someone might say, what have you been doing since you left? If you are currently working, why do you want to leave and come back here? Of course, a question about why you left there in the first place and why you want to come back. They might straight up ask you how long you plan to stay. And they may ask what would make you leave again. So these are some things that you would want to consider before going into an interview and then, kind of plan out how you want to answer. All right. Just like with any interview, you also want to come prepared with some questions to ask the employer, your former employer. So at FlexJobs, we have hired, Boomerang employees before. And, some of the things that they've asked or that you might consider asking, you know, would be around the company culture, maybe what changes have occurred in the company and team structuring. How have work processes and standard operating procedures evolved? And how do you evaluate my return to the company? What would you like me to accomplish within the first 30, 60, 90 days of my return? Those are some things that you might consider thinking through, whichever one fits you and your style. You might have a couple questions at the ready. Those are some things that I would think about asking as part of your interview for your new role at your old company. Also, in keeping with best practices, you still want to send a thank you note after you interview. It's good to keep fostering that relationship. So if you do end up returning to the employer, the relationship continues in a positive way and is off to a good second start, if you will. All right, so what kind of action do you need to take if you are considering boomeranging back to a former employer? Well, first, identify which previous employer you want to target and think about how you exited and really kind of reflect on how that relationship ended or didn't end and still is a cordial relationship to kind of formulate how you want to get back in touch with the company so that you can then begin your correspondence. Remember that since you've left, if you've worked especially, you will have more skills, professional development, experience, and growth. So you definitely want to highlight that on your resume, cover letter, and of course in your interview. You're going to review, revise, and tailor your application and really reach out to somebody to let them know that you applied, somebody that you know at the company, and then you'll prepare for your interview going through the steps that we talked about. And after that interview, you're going to do a follow-up and make sure that you send a thank you note. All right, as promised, we are going to do a Q&A, but before we get there, I just want to remind everybody we will be sending this recording to the email address you used to register. We also encourage you to go to the flexjobs.com blog. The article section of our website has thousands of articles on any topic for your job search, including boomeranging back to an old employer, but also any other component of a job search that might be helpful for you. So please go ahead and check out those resources. And with that said, let's go ahead and see what questions we have. All right, we have a few questions here. First question, when you say 76% of HR professionals are more accepting of Boomerang employees compared to what? Compared to other applicants or compared to how they used to view Boomerang employees? In this particular survey, it looks like it was how they used to view Boomerang employees. You remember a few years ago, we had the Great Resignation where a lot of people were resigning because the job market was a lot more robust. During the aftermath, if you will, the couple years after the pandemic. And so the, I guess, favorability of employees returning was viewed a little bit, or has been viewed a little bit differently than in previous times. If you left a company because they had offered you a buyout as a company-wide effort to reduction in force, does that make a difference in how you approach the company versus having left by quitting? I think it could. This is why it's really important that when you leave a job, you don't really burn any bridges, so you can leave that door open. But certainly, if the company had to do some restructuring because of a reduction in force, and now they are in a hiring space, definitely reaching out to your connections at the company, I think makes a lot of sense. Let's see. The presentation was from the point of view of a resignation. What about from the point of view of a termination? Yeah, so this is certainly something where um, the best luck that people will probably have would be if they left on good terms, or as a result of being laid off and developing and fostering those relationships. I think depending on the relationships you have with an organization, the individuals within an organization and the circumstances behind your termination can dictate whether or not it's a place that you would pursue potentially going back to. Did you say to send a follow-up after your application? Would you expand on this? Yeah, I think it's always helpful, whether you're applying somewhere that you've worked previously or a new place, to follow up on your application. Just especially, well, in this instance, as a boomerang, you probably have the name and email address of somebody that you are in direct contact with. So keeping lines of communication open with them makes a lot of sense. I would wait probably about a week from when you submit the application to then following up and sending a quick note. Can you return to a job if you left due to alleged harassment and potential discrimination if there was a change in management or CEO? I think it's possible. Again, this goes back to the relationships that you have with those who are still at the company, and what changed and what the circumstances were around your previous departure. It may be harder to land a role back at a company where you left not on good terms or were terminated. I won't say it's impossible because I just don't know, but certainly something to consider. If you were hired as an outsourced resource, is that considered a boomerang? I mean, it's possible, right? Because even though you weren't technically an employee, or maybe you were doing some temporary work for them and you are interested in a full-time role, certainly it could be. I wouldn't be tied up on whether or not you are a boomerang or not. If you're interested in the opportunity, reaching out to some of the contacts that you have at that organization does make a lot of sense, particularly if your working relationships were strong. If you worked for a company in one country and later went to join their branch in another country after relocation, does that count as being a boomerang employee? I don't know if you were rehired. I think it's possible you could have been a continuous employee, or if you went to another location and had to apply and get rehired, then I think it depends on how the company is structured, and if they have different entities that are owned slightly by different people. I'm not sure on the legalities of that or what that would look like. But again, it does speak to your ability to build relationships, and also that referrals work and are important in this market. What about if the circumstance of your leaving was a PIP? If your intended return is for a completely different role, is that also viewed negatively? I don't think, again, I think this is so individualized based on the relationships that there were and how things were left. when you exited your previous role. I certainly think going back to a company into a new role, particularly if since you've been gone, you've done upskilling or you have additional experience, all of that can be very valuable to a potential return to an employer that you worked at before. And so I think it can be looked at very positively. I think that if it was something that the company didn't want to pursue with you, they would let you know, or they would not respond to your reaching out to them. Would be my guess on how that might play out. All right. I'm not seeing any other questions. I'll give it another minute or so and just remind everybody that we will be sending a link to this recording. I know this is a really interesting and kind of unique topic that maybe we don't think about a lot, but certainly there are options if we have good relationships with those people that we used to work with, and if we have committed to continuing and fostering those relationships even after we leave a position, that can be really beneficial. So you can look for that recording. I see a thank you. You're welcome. What if many years have passed and you don't have any current contacts? Well, you still have the ability to build some rapport and make an introduction saying, I used to work here. I know things have changed in terms of leadership since I've been here. Here's what I've been up to in my career since. And I noticed you have this opening, and I'd be really interested in talking further about this position. Thank you for this webinar. You're welcome. I'm glad this was really helpful, everybody. I appreciate all of your questions. We do have another webinar at the top of the hour, so we sort of have a double header today. And if you join there, make sure you say hi, and we will talk to you then. Let's see what just popped in. Let's see, a bit out of topic, but since we still have a bit of time, do ATS have issues with special characters like percentage, etc.? They can, yes. So you want to be very careful on what particular characters you use. That and or ampersand symbol is something that can cause some issues occasionally. The percent can cause issues as well. So be careful in what special signs you use there. I notice a lot of companies don't respond at all if they want to interview you. Could you address why? If no response, should I assume they are not interested? Um, Sorry, I think, do you mean companies don't respond if they don't want to interview you? Um, because I think if they did want to interview you, they certainly would reach out to try to schedule something. It is in this market, um, okay, good. Okay. Yes. So yes, if you don't hear back from an employer, or if get sort of the canned response that they're reviewing your application and you don't hear anything, certainly following up makes a lot of sense. However, employers are getting such a high volume of applicants, they are not necessarily personally responding to each one of the applicants that they have, why they are not interviewing them, and usually they don't tell you anyway because of legal reasons. And so you're not going to get a lot of information on why they've selected other candidates. I would say that this is why it's so important to continually be applying for jobs and not waiting for an employer to reach out to you. There's about a 2% chance that you'll get contacted for an interview for each application you submit. And so that's just the data that's out there. It's frustrating as a job seeker to be applying to such a high volume of jobs and to be experiencing such a low return on investment in time in terms of setting up interviews. But that's kind of where the market is right now. It is nothing against you. Or the quality of the work that you do. It's just the way that the market is, the number of volume, or the hundreds of applicants that employers are getting for each job that they post is very high. And so there's just not a lot of time for them to respond to everybody. All right. Well, we did it. We got through that second round of questions too. We will see you at the top of the hour if you are interested in coming back to the next webinar. Otherwise, I appreciate your time today. Hopefully, this was helpful. Good luck, continued luck to you all as you navigate this market. And we are happy to be able to give resources and help wherever we can. So, thanks for spending some time with us, and we'll see you later. Bye bye.